Wait! I'm a what? Written by Atina Blackcharm. Chapter 7. Finders Keepers. The longer Danny stayed and did things in the city, the more Danny slowly fit into Gotham. It helped that the city herself was more than happy to have his company. She was glad that he made a hunt, letting his powers leak into the city, strengthening what had been sick and weakening for so long. That was probably another reason why Clockwork had dropped him off here. Not that Danny would ever get a straight answer about it, but with his hunt being strengthened, Danny became more and more in tune with it, even sensing those who resided in his haunt if he focused, or those he had declared under his protection. He couldn't help but smile when he sensed Mr. Croc was back in his hunt. It was easy to hone in where specifically, and easy to slip into the underground sewer system, just in time to be in his path and hear an unfamiliar voice call Mr. Croc Valen. He thought Valen was a nice name, and hoped he'd be given the privilege to use it when he asked for permission. When Danny got the okay to use it, there was a pleasant hum in his chest. Names were special things. As a Halfer, Danny knew that very well. The ghosts of the infinite realms only support the idea by their persistence in calling him by certain titles. Like how Frostbite and the Yiddies call him Great One, along with how everyone proudly stated who they were. Pride, honor, respect, and power were in their names. Then there was the simple fact that Danny knew how important it was to be called by what you wanted others to call you. It was like how he insisted on the name Danny more than Danielle. So Danny would be sure to be kind with Valen's name. There was another man behind Valen that Danny didn't recognize. He could tell though that they were well fit, muscles suited to being used to a fight. He thought back to the last time he had seen Valen in a fight, where he was outnumbered. The memory inked him, and then he kept an eye on the stranger, ready for a fight if need be. Then he didn't care to tell him his name either, and checked to see if Valen didn't want them near. Except Valen looked like he was completely fine, and when he asked, the stranger left, saying his goodbyes as one would do to a friend. Once it was just the two of them, then he joined Valen on the ground. It was a nice walk, and he managed to get Valen to come to visit Miss Judy with him. Miss Judy, of course, was more than happy for the company. After the visit and back on the street, then he found himself leading Valen to the building where he was now staying in. Admittedly, it was much better than Mr. Madden's building. Valen was quiet as they walked inside while Danny told him a bit about it. This is where you stayed last night. It's kind of like an open door situation where you can come and go. Legally speaking, we are squinting, but whoever the owner is hasn't come around or anything, so Danny shrugged. It is what we want it to be for now, which includes this room. Danny pointed to his newly appointed room. Being mine. Just moved my stuff here. Country of the little shadows. That's 'cause Mr. Madden's building is shit, another voice said, and then he saw that Zipper was at the end of the hall. Zipper looked at Valen, who stood behind Danny, before looking back at Danny. Then he could tell they were curious. Ran into him again. Danny said, "Duh, don't have to explain it to me." Zipper snarked before looking back at Valen. Danny had a hole in his ceiling, and a door I don't know how he got open. Danny huffed, and ignored the amused look Valen was giving him. "I have my ways." "Dumb ways. Thought I'd die waiting for you to open that door. Anyways, I'ma sleep in one of the rooms tonight, Danny." "Sounds good. I'll be in my room." Yeah. Night, Danny. And night, Mr. Killer Croc. And Dad super quickly went inside of the rooms and shut the door. Danny snorted at the little interaction before looking at Valen. That was Zipper, by the way. And be warned, only Miss Shuney can call them Zip. Valen made a sound of acknowledgement. One of them little shadows you mentioned? Yep, there's a few more you will probably see around if you stick around, which you can. There's plenty of room. Valen looked around the hallway and glanced at the room he was last in before saying he'd think about it. Then he didn't push and bid Valen good night, while thanking him for coming along with him. The next morning, when Danny set out, Valen wasn't there, and Zipper was still asleep in their room. But he could still tell that Valen was within the bounds of his haunt, which was fine. He knew how others didn't tend to stay inside the building for long, and then he was well accustomed to how there were people that tended to be on the move. Ellie had been one of those people. She traveled all over the world and met all sorts of people, sending postcards and weird little souvenirs. Danny wouldn't make anyone stay where they didn't want to stay, but he'd make sure that they were welcome whenever they wanted. Ellie had told him how she was always grateful he had done that. He was sure she would have liked the folks in the neighborhood. Maybe Ellie would have been able to make some friends and cause trouble, especially with the kids. It was a thought that kept popping up when he saw the little shadows that were the kids. The thought brought up a little pain, but it made him smile every time. He could feel it again as he listened to the news Snaps told him while Tick and Tack stood behind her. Apparently, there was some trouble with drugs in Crime Alley. Tack had been unusually sober during the whole interaction, as Snaps told him the situation. Another thing was that Danny could sense growing anger in the hunt, especially next door. He kept thinking it over, and what could have been happening when he had to stop to catch an apple that was thrown at him. It was a nice apple, and when Danny looked up, he saw Old Man LJ glaring at him. There was another apple in his other hand. Old Man LJ only stopped glaring once Danny took a bite of the apple before he walked off in the direction of his house. This kept happening a few more times over the next few days, and then he started to dream of flying fruit. He brought it up with Trix while she was on a short little break. Danny, he's just showing he cares, Trix said. He was eating her own fruit, some grapes and orange slices that Victoria had packed for her. By throwing fruit? Danny took a bite from yet another apple that he caught before it hit his head. It was green and more sour than sweet. Trix shrugged. He is a gruff old man, and he knows you will catch it. Just to prove her point, she tossed a grape, which Danny caught. See? Then he plopped the grape in his mouth. Old men are weird. That's the second one I know. The other one just talks like a crypt and likes green sticky notes. Doesn't sound too bad, Trix said. I mean, you got that nice raincoat and hat. Don't see you taking them off too often. Danny instinctively touched the hat on his head. It's comfy, and you never know when it's gonna rain in Gotham. Trix gave him a deadpan look as she popped another grape into her mouth. Danny, you always know when it's gonna rain. She looked all too pleased with herself when Danny didn't have a response to that other than him taking another bite of his apple. Mateo had been given a job to do by Red Hood, and damn it, he was going to do it, especially if it meant a chance to get away from Stan. He still seemed on edge, and Mateo didn't want to take his chances. He'd leave that to Nikolai. The man had been hovering in the background like a shadow, despite his huge stature. There had been some overdoses due to some tainted drugs being sold in the last few days. no one had died yet, but last night there was a close call involving a mom of 2 kids. Hood had been there, and after getting the mom medical treatment, he went out again. When Hood came back, it was in the early hours of the morning, and his clothes had some new stains that Matteo recognized as blood. Without even cleaning up, Hood had walked up to him and placed a slightly bloody note in his hands. "Find him," Hood said, and Matteo could only respond with a nod. When left alone, Matteo opened the note to see the name Franklin Sharpie, written down in shaky handwriting. A smudged bloody fingerprint in the corner that probably belonged to the writer. Not a lot to go on, but that was fine. Matteo knew how to track someone down and get what he needed. He'd been doing it long before Red Hood showed up in Crime Alley. Hell, he had been one of the first people to find Red Hood, and as a result found new terms of employment once he got to know what Hood's deal was. That and not get shot by the gun Hood had trained on him within a second. If Hood wanted Sharpie, then Matteo would get him. This was the thought Matteo kept repeating mentally, as he also cursed Franklin out in his head with the way the asshole kept moving around so damn much. He had to be one of the most paranoid drug dealers ever, which made sense, but still, Matteo wanted to choke him out with how little sleep he was getting to keep up with Franklin the last 3 days. Eventually, though, Franklin finally came to a stop just on the outskirts of Crime Alley, where there were a concerning amount of abandoned buildings. Not the smartest move, and only made Matteo more pissed off that they ended up here. Matteo hadn't been in this part before, and it felt a little unsettled as he walked down the street. Getting inside the building was easy, minus almost falling down a hole in the floor, or having to watch out for clunk of concrete that just missed his head. He walked a bit quicker, not wanting to stay too long in a building that should be demolished. It was on the 3rd floor that Matteo finally heard something. He crept along the wall and towards the doorway where the sound was coming from. His gun in his hands, pointed down until he absolutely needed it. When he reached the doorway, he peeked his head through and had his gun pointed, ready to finally confront the asshole that sold bad drugs to Hood's people. Except, instead of Franklin, Matteo saw a teen in a raincoat and a blue-knitted head ruffling through Franklin's pockets, while the man was unconscious on the floor. With the diligence expected of a street kid, all pockets were turned inside out, and cash was swiftly taken out of a wallet. No hesitation or unease as they went through Franklin's things. It also looked like they had yet to notice that Matteo was there, so he thought he'd just wait until they left to deal with Franklin and find out where his stash was. But that plan went out the window when he saw the teen suddenly pick up a duffel bag and pull out a bag of what was clearly full of drugs. At that, Matteo stepped into the dim light and kept his gun out of view, not wanting to scare them off, but careful in case they had a weapon too. "Right, I'm gonna need that." The teen didn't jump in surprise or bother turning their head to look at Matteo. Instead, they just put the drugs back into the duffel bag and zipped it closed. It was only then that they finally turned their head. Their eyes looked over him carefully. Matteo saw how they definitely looked right at the spot where he was hiding his gun. Finders keepers. The slow-growing unease that Matteo had suddenly turned into confusion. "What?" "Finders keepers," they repeated, hefting the strap of the duffel bag on their shoulder. "Just what the hell do you think you're gonna do with all that?" Matteo asked. It was a bag full of tainted shit, and the scrawny-looking teen looked like they'd get killed before selling drugs. Except he could never be careful. Matteo couldn't have a kid selling, especially tainted shit. Hood would have his head Stan would have worse. The teen glared at him. What are you gonna do about it? Get rid of it. Shit's tainted. Almost killed a few people. At that, Matteo saw how their mouth twisted into disgust. Good. So hand it over. Nope. Matteo frowned. Seriously? He asked exasperatedly. The kids Matteo knew in Crime Alley would have already handed the bag over. They know how Hood was about drugs and kids mixing together. They shrugged. Gotta make a living, don't I? So how about a deal? Yeah. And what do you expect that will be? Matteo asked as he put his gun away and crossed his arms. The teen smiled. A finder's fee, of course. After all, I'm the finder of this finder's keeper situation. Now that was something reminiscent of the Crime Alley kids Matteo knew. He had a feeling Hood would find it funny. He had a soft spot for kids. Matteo did too, but he wished that this was happening after he had gotten more sleep, and not in a building that looked like it could collapse at any moment. After a bit of haggling, and honestly the conversation kept turning into different directions, Matteo found himself heading back with a minor headache. Matteo hadn't noticed how weird it felt in the abandoned building until he got further and further away from it. Once he started to see familiar buildings of Crime Alley, it felt like he could breathe freely again than before, a bit more settled in his own skin even, with the extra load of the duffel bag and the unconscious body he had with him. The X-ray didn't prove to be too much trouble, and anyone who looked at him recognized who he was and came to the conclusion that it was probably Hood's business, before going on their way. Eventually, Matteo finally arrived at the building where Red Hood wanted to meet up. Nikolai was the first to see him and helped move Franklin. In the meantime, Matteo walked over to where Stan was set up before setting the bag of drugs on the table. But instead of leaving, he lingered by the table. Stan had already grabbed a hold of the bag and started taking out the drugs, organizing them and taking inventory. Without looking up, Stan asked, "What is it?" At the bite in Stan's tone, Matteo glanced towards Nikolai, hoping for some help or even more support in the face of Stan's eerie. He was promptly ignored. Russian bastard. Had to make a deal to get the bag. Someone else came across it first. Stan continued counting and wrote something down. Who was it? And what was the deal? A teenager, Matteo said. And it was money, cash, nothing we will miss. They offered a deal when I told them that we'd be getting rid of it. Kid didn't look too upset about the idea of drugs going to no one. Stan hummed. The kids usually don't. They know how Hood is. Where was this? Matteo paused. He had originally thought that it had been on the outskirts, and thought of the only street sign he remembered he passed while coming back, past Roden Street in an abandoned building. When he answered, Stan paused his movement and looked at him. That's not in Crime Alley. And Roden Street is where Hood heard news about a shootout over drugs during the storm. That doesn't have to mean anything, right? Matteo asked, hoping this really wasn't some sort of precursor to trouble. No news came up about those drugs or groups. Police didn't even make a report about it, according to our guy, and this was just a street code, even if they weren't from around here. Stan stared at him for a moment, before looking back down at the table and continuing to count. Maybe, he said, maybe not. Stan didn't say anything more. Matteo took that as a chance to walk away. He walked past where Nikolai tied up Franklin. The man was still unconscious. Matteo didn't even envy him for when Red Hood would get here and wake him up. Tick and Track had hidden the moment Bright Eyes told them to. There was no hesitation to leave with Franklin's unconscious body, and find a dark spot to huddle down out of sight. Of course, it was a spot where they still had a clear view of Danny, as he did his usual picking of items, never failing to find the good stuff. Earlier they were there when Snaps told Danny about some overdoses because of some drugs in Crime Alley. Snaps knew a few people that lived in Crime Alley who kept her up to date on what was going on, though she never shared why she wasn't with them. Not that they ever asked. That wasn't how they did things here. Snaps had told him first, considering it was Franklin Sharpie who was supposedly selling the stuff. Track and Trick were familiar with the name. It was the reason why someone they used to know died a couple of years back. Trick had shared that with Danny on the way to the building they were hiding in now. Danny didn't point out the tears in her eyes when she told him, didn't look at the two of them with pity. He never looked at any of them with pity. It was quiet as they waited to see what was it that made Danny tell them to hide. Track tightened his hold on Trick's hand when a man showed up in the doorway with a gun, only relaxing when the man hid his gun and spoke instead of shooting Danny outright, while he had his back turned. Bright Eyes was good at talking. It was funny seeing how the man tried to make sense of everything Danny said or did, clearly not used to the little mixture of things Danny picked up from the people around the neighborhood, and little characteristics he had long before he showed up. Everyone else was basically used to it, sort of, but this stranger was experiencing it for the first time. Tack tapped on Tick's hand, and when she looked, he made a gesture as if he was putting something on his head, sort of like a helmet. She looked back at the man, and sure enough, if she looked closely, she could see the hint of red that Red Hood's men tended to wear. Nothing too obvious, if you didn't know what you were looking for. That was how it was for a lot of different groups. Gangs were more subtle about it in comparison to the goons of people like the Joker or the Riddler. They wondered if maybe Bright Eye was gonna push for them to have some sort of identifier too. But so far, it didn't look like he'd run things like what you'd usually expect from a boss. He was a weird one. Hood's guy seemed to be coming to the same conclusion as he tried to navigate his way through the drug deal Bright Eyes was trying to make. Tick and Tack remained silent throughout the whole exchange, not daring to make a sound, even after Hood's guy and Bright Eye exchanged cash and the bag, or how Franklin was promptly dragged out of the building. "You guys good?" Danny asked after a bit more time had passed. The two of them came out of their hiding spot, and to Danny, "We're fine," Track said. "But why did you sell the drugs to Hood's guy?" Danny had never shown interest in drugs before, as far as Track had known. "Hood's guy?" Danny asked. Trick nodded. "Red Hood, who's in charge of Crime Alley. That was one of his men." Danny tilted his head and looked pensive, but not bothered. He didn't look surprised, and Tick was reminded about how Eric said that Danny respected Hood's territory or haunt, along with the fact that Danny didn't want trouble with Hood. So maybe some business was good, especially if Hood didn't want dirty drugs being sold. "I don't like drugs, or any substance that can hurt someone like that," Danny finally said. "But what if he sells it?" Track asked. There was always the chance that someone didn't follow their boss's rules. The kids already heard of that happening a few times. "He won't." When Danny said that, he sounded so sure, like there was no chance he could be wrong. Tick and Track shared a look. They knew you could never be sure of things in Gotham. Usually things took a turn, typically for the worse, no matter how much you wished it wouldn't. "That's just how I A pat on their heads broke through their thoughts, and they saw Danny looking at ease. I wouldn't have sold it to him if he had been lying. And if I find out, and I will find out, that he was, Danny smiled, there will be consequences. I will promise that. For some reason, Tick and Track couldn't help but feel reassured. But I seemed like someone who'd kept his promises. It was a day later when Danny realized, with his newfound amount of cash, he could actually go buy some things. Still things, considering the amount that he had managed to get. At first, he was going to buy things for the others. But when Tuck told Zipper, who told Eric, who told Sandra, Danny found himself being scolded and told to get himself something for once. Either buy something for yourself, or I go and tell old man LJ, Sandra threatened after Danny asked if she needed anything. Danny slumped down on himself, because he knew Sandra wasn't lying, and he didn't know what else old man LJ might toss at him or hand him silently. It felt odd to take things and not give something in return. Everything was telling him to do more things for those in his haunt. He thought about Jimmy's sneakers and Snap's sister. He thought about how Beth had a cough and how Veronica needed some ingredients for another recipe she wanted to try. Then he thought about how it was the beginning of September and the temperature would slowly get lower and lower over the next few months. He wanted to give, he wanted to protect them and keep them safe. That he didn't even need a lot to live. He had gone for so long with nothing, as he wondered before Clockwork dropped him off in Gotham. Why should he do anything differently? Danny, Sandra said, and when Danny looked at her, he was reminded of Jazz, a young woman that had the responsibility to take care of someone younger than her, particularly all by herself. Sandra's eyes didn't waver, and he knew she wouldn't take no for an answer. He let out a sigh of defeat, and Sandra smiled. Her smile was different from Jazz's. While Danny tried to think what he would get for himself, he strolled on the rooftops, walking along the edge before hopping to the next one. He even asked Gotham what she thought, but all he got back was the impression of amusement, which she apparently was a lot more now if Danny thought about it. The other night he heard her laughing at Valen. He was sitting on the edge, swinging his feet in the open air, trying to have Gotham give him a hint on what he should get, when he noticed something off about one of the manhole covers in the street. It looked like it had been moved recently, although anyone else wouldn't have noticed at all. Then he smiled. He had been hoping to see Valen again. He could sense him in his haunt. Valen tended to be on the ground most of the time. It seems that Eric had been correct in the little tidbit that Valen was a loner or avoided people. It was easy for Danny to let himself lean forward and off the roof. His landing, as usual, was silent. The shadows easily reached out to cover him, and Danny was sure that Gotham also had them do that for her nights, along with those that needed to hide. He walked over to the manhole cover. It was even easier to slip through it. One moment he was climbing down the ladder, and the next he felt something grab his leg. He was pulled off the ladder, and then he found himself hanging upside down by the point of contact on his leg. The raincoat had fallen with the sudden change and covered his face, and then he swayed in the air. Yet again, Gotham was laughing. It sounded like hissing smoke this time, and raindrops. It was because of that, the fact that he didn't sense any sort of danger, and the sensation of familiar death nearby, that then he let himself hang. If he looked down or up, considering he was in an upside-down position, he could see the edge of very large dress shoes. Then they began to move. It was a slow movement, and the thing that held his leg never loosened or tightened its grip. One could say it was relaxing, so Danny let his eyes close and himself sway as he was carried off into the darkness of the sewers. Valen had been staying with Grundy on the ground. There was a nice open part where the tunnels from different directions converged. It had enough space to set up things. Grundy took up one corner and set up a little makeshift table decorated with a pile of trinkets he had, usually things he picked up on his daily wanderings through the underground tunnels. Already, Valen could hear the familiar footsteps of Grundy growing closer. "How was the walk?" he called out, not bothering just yet to turn around, as he was going through some of his things. "Grundy found something," Grundy replied. He sounded a little bit happier, and Valen figured it must have been something interesting, like the gun Grundy found the other day. "Oh, you did?" He wondered what would be added to the pile. He turned around. What was it? Turned around. The thing Grundy found was, in fact, a person. A person Grundy was holding upside down by a leg. Someone suspiciously quiet and still. "Shit, did you kill someone?" Grundy frowned at him and looked at the body he was carrying with one hand. Grundy did not hurt, only carry. He brought the body closer and poked the torso with the other hand. One could hear a huff of air leave the covered head. Grundy did not kill. Despite the relief that Grundy didn't kill someone, Valen was still trying to figure out what they would do. No doubt the person got scared shitless and passed out after coming across Grundy in the sewers. They'd probably pass out again or start screaming once they woke up and see that Killer Croc was in their vicinity and Grundy was still holding them. Wasn't exactly conducive to the plan of avoiding trouble. The agreement with Danny had been based on the fact that he didn't mess with the folks around here, so they'd have to move. Soon word would be out that Killer Croc were nearby, and the bats or others looking for a fight would follow. He was just about to ask about where Grundy even found this person when he saw Grundy had lifted them and was moving the coat to uncover their face while looking closely. Whoever it was about to get a close-up with Grundy, and Valen prepared to hear a scream of horror, as was the usual response to Grundy's appearance. Except a familiar face was revealed when Grundy moved the fabric out of the way. Wearing a blue-knitted hat, somehow still sticking on his head, was Danny, who looked straight at Grundy, not at all concerned with Grundy staring at him curiously, or so closely. After a moment, Danny looked away from Grundy and at Valen. "Hey, Valen," Danny said with the same smile he always had whenever he saw Valen. "Who's your friend?"